for watching Truth and Justice with Vivian King. Happy New Year. It's 2018, and this is my first show of the year, and I'm excited to have my routine, regular, can't get rid of him, co-host Danny Sneed, who has brought a delightful person into the audience tonight, a different person tonight. His case is out of another county, in Montgomery County. His name is Mr. Christopher Flakus. And Christopher, thank you for volunteering and being willing to share your story tonight. Danny, I'm gonna start with you. Do something a little different. How did you meet Chris, and how did you happen to invite him tonight?
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here, Vivian, on my birthday. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor to
Happy
spend it with you.
birthday to you, and many more.
But I couldn't think of a better place to spend my birthday.
All right.
Is given the opportunity to do something positive. I met Chris every 6 weeks. I do a segment on the prison show.
Okay.
KPTF. KPFT. And that's 90.1. 90.1. It's a local station here in Houston, Texas. What this platform does is it addresses all issues related to the criminal justice system, especially like the death row. They do a lot of death row watch.
Death row. So
every 6 weeks, I have a small segment where I address all the veterans that are incarcerated and to provide them information of some of the resources that are here available for them when they get out and what they can do while they're still there as far as their veteran status. Okay. So on this particular Friday, and I was there doing my segment, I met Chris in the setup room, and just through him hearing my program and me hearing a little about his background, the more I found out about who he was and what he had experienced, he fit the profile of truth and justice, where it would give him a platform to tell his real truth. And I thought it would be something that would help him on his journey of being in recovery. So it was about two brothers in recovery, giving each other an opportunity to strengthen what we wanted out of life. And that's just to maintain a status of sobriety. So that really was the link. Yeah. And he had been a part of the criminal justice system, which you know very well, Vivian. I have quite a history with the Texas criminal justice system. 15 years of actual incarceration and 26 years on parole.
26 years on parole. My God, that's...
We celebrated when he got off parole.
That's something to celebrate.
Yeah, that was a few Augusts ago, right?
Yeah, a couple of Augusts ago.
And be excited that I remember the month.
Yeah. I mean, but I did.
I have a lot of information in my mind, so I can remember the month.
What was historic about that moment, not just coming off parole, is that was in August, and the election year was in November, right? And I was able to vote in that next election soon after. So if you're out there getting off parole, and as long as you're not on parole, you can vote. Yeah. So you have power, but you're powerless if you don't use that power. So if you should vote if you're not on. If you have been on parole and you're not on parole,
you can vote.
You can vote.
You can also vote if you're on deferred adjudication because it's not a conviction.
I voted, and I'm on deferred adjudication, and I had not voted the previous two elections. Too caught up in my addiction at the time, but it felt, appropriate to use my vote this year, and I'm certainly glad I did.
So I'm so excited about hearing your story. So, and I liked what you just said, two brothers in recovery. In fact, I'm gonna name the show that. I like that. So anyway, Chris, tell us who Chris is. Where were you born? How were you raised? Tell me about your background leading up until you first got involved with drugs or alcohol.
Of course. Well, I was born in Miami, Florida in 1985. I would have been born in Mexico City. My mother and my mother's family is from Mexico City, but there was a terrible earthquake that year, killed quite a lot of people. My father was up until recently a journalist with The Voice of America, so we traveled a lot. We lived in Costa Rica during my childhood. It was an idyllic childhood, and I really want to emphasize that my background was a loving, supportive, comforting one. The troubles that I ran into really began in my adolescence when we moved to Mexico City from Southern California. Up until then, as I said, my childhood was idyllic. It was just fun in the sun, playing. I was an only child, so there's an element of loneliness that, looking back, was You know, like I had bunk beds, for instance, which I think was symbolic. You know, it's kind of like, Mom, if you want to decide to have another one, you know, we already got the bunk beds, but it didn't end up happening that way. And you know, I definitely was showered with attention and love, and there was the kind of helicopter mom element to my mother and father. I mean, I was certainly, you know, their world. You know, everything they did revolved around me, keeping me happy and trying to give me the best future possible. And that's still true to this day. I mean, they've remained my biggest support, you know, even with the hell that I put them through. We moved to Mexico City when I was about 12 years old, just on the verge of adolescence. And that's really where the change began. You know, I was having trouble adjusting in the schools. There was a racial element, you know, being half Latino but looking more white. My father's from South Dakota. You know, I look a little bit more like my father.
Yeah, you do.
But my mother's also kind of a light-skinned Mexican. I mean, Mexico's a lot like America in that it's a melting pot. You know, there's indigenous blood in almost everyone from Mexico, but some people look more European. And that was difficult for me to be accepted as a Mexican by my peers when I was suddenly thrust into a school that was a Mexican system, classes in Spanish. I'm glad that I had that experience because I'm bilingual today, and you know, I was able to.
Oh, but how did you learn it at 12?
Well,
I go to school there.
Spanish was actually my first language, and you know,
so your mother taught you.
My
Spanish.
mother taught me Spanish.
I see.
But it was kind of I call it ñoño Spanish, which in Spanish, ñoño means kind of like a goody-goody Spanish. It was a Spanish devoid of slang, devoid of bad language, and so the other kids, you know, certainly gave me a hard time for this kind of like clean Spanish. I quickly did my best to learn all the bad words and slang and catch up. I also realized that, you know, this was a world where even at 12, there was parties with alcohol. Lots of alcohol, open bar, and I realized that in order to fit in, you know, I needed to make some adjustments to my life. So I'd say the first time I really got truly drunk was at 12. It was that year, in an effort to fit in, and I loved it. It was it was wonderful. You know, it was this amazing discovery. Like, I don't know what this feeling is, but I'm pretty sure I want to do it as much as possible for the rest of my life.
Oh my God!
It's unfortunate, but it was also, you know, a Catholic society with a lot of drinking. Was socially part of every celebration. New Year's Eve, everyone was a little toasty. It was a society where alcoholism in Mexico does seem to get buried, and I actually really sympathize with addicts and alcoholics living in Mexico. There's a strong 12-step presence there, and there's meetings all over the city. But to be part of Mexican society and all the traditions without drinking is difficult. I mean, even during the holidays, we drink rompope, which is kind of like a punch with a sugar cane in it, highly alcoholic. That was actually my first drunk, came from this rompope. The drugs came shortly afterwards when I moved to an American high school. In the interim, I'd gone to an all-boys Catholic school, and that was where I did, you know, first come to face ugly truths, abuse, violence.
Is this still in Mexico?
It's still in Mexico. It's called the Oxford Institute, and I can honestly say that it was worse than jail. Sometimes when I was incarcerated in Texas, I would tell myself, "You can get through this. It's not as bad as Oxford was."
What's Oxford?
It was basically a Catholic all boys junior high. So this would have been right before high school. The system's different in Mexico. It's not divided like junior high, high school. It's like prepa and, you know, preparatoria, like preparatory school. The fact that it was an all-boys school with this, you know, the priests were basically lords of this school. You know, they were completely in control. There was a religious aspect that I rebelled against very strongly. There was abuse going on for...
Like what kind of abuse?
Well, it was still a certain degree of physical punishment.
Physical punishment.
Hitting
corporal
students
punishment.
Corporal punishment. What really sticks out was, you know, the pollution in Mexico is really terrible. We wore these little white uniforms in Oxford, and for going out of line, sometimes we'd be asked to grab onto this chain link fence that was by a busy street outside of the school, and once our uniforms had turned kind of gray with the soot from the pollution, then we were allowed to come inside. And at that point, you know, we were just sick from the fumes. And that was yeah, it was atrocious. And I made it my mission to be expelled from that school, and I succeeded. I succeeded. And after that, I was moved into, you know, where I wanted to go from in the first place was an American high school, El Americano, the American School Foundation, which was nicknamed El Ameriguano, the Ameriguano. That was really why my mom didn't want me to go in the first place. She was, you know, she didn't want me to be around that element. Having gone through this terrible experience, I wanted to know exactly what was so terrible that I couldn't go to the American school right off the bat. I wanted to know firsthand what drugs felt like, because, you know, in order to protect me, which was why I was placed in this kind of extremely conservative environment, you know, I suffered greatly. I came out with a rebellious streak. So it wasn't long before I tried marijuana, and that felt like, oh my God, I've been lied to my whole life. This wasn't terrible. This wasn't like one hit, you're hooked. This was just a lovely feeling, you know? And it was a slow descent into deeper addiction. You know, for a long time it was just marijuana, drinking socially, but the negative consequences started almost immediately. I did end up getting expelled from the American school with a group of my friends for selling pot, you know, and it was really devastating at the time.
How old were you?
I was 16 years old, 16 or 17 at that time. You know, I'd finally made this close group of friends, and we were kind of a group comprised of being the odd man out. You know, a lot of my friends were from Venezuela who were in that school. Some of them were the sons and daughters of American military that were stationed in Mexico. We were the ones who just didn't fit in with the norm, which were the kind of like upper echelon white Mexican kids who we called the fresas, which means strawberry. And they called us a number of dirty words that I don't know if you hear. But, you know, we were kind of this subculture, you know, a sort of tattooed, pierced, dyed hair subculture. And I felt, you know, after the loneliness of my childhood, that I'd finally found a kind of family unit.
Right.
When we moved to Texas, I did my best to find the same group of people with the same interests. And
So how old were you when you moved to Texas?
I was 17. I turned 18 here in Texas. At that point, I'd experimented with just about every drug, at least once. And because I had used and not gotten addicted, I would use my own life. I mean, as an 18-year-old, I thought I knew everything. And I would tell people, you know, these drugs aren't as addictive as everyone says. I've done this and this and this and this, and look at me, I'm fine. And I lived on that self-deception for a long time. You know, my grades were okay. I felt like I was, you know, passionate about the career I eventually wanted to follow. I wanted to study writing. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to teach literature. There were 2 or 3 teachers that I'd had in Mexico that were just passionate about literature, and they were the kind of teachers that changed my life. And I wanted to do for other kids what they had done for me. That ended up getting derailed because of drugs, but even before heroin, which was the game changer for me, which is what completely changed my life, it was almost like it was waiting for me. I had just a few months before we moved to Texas, I had a chemistry teacher who was discussing the chemistry of drugs. And she had worked in a methadone clinic in Canada. She was a Canadian professor. And I don't know what I said, but I made some kind of joke, some kind of crack about methadone treatment, and she was so furious. And she was a teacher that I felt close to. I felt like I could trust her, but I saw a whole different side of her when I made light of heroin addiction. She kept me after class, and she said, "Chris, you more than anyone need to take this seriously." And I didn't. I felt insulted that she would suggest that I would, you know, ever be a lowly heroin addict, and I kind of was offended by it. But my God, I've thought back on that throughout my life. I mean, it's like she knew from her experience.
Prophecy almost.
Prophecy. I mean, she really knew, and she could tell.
Do you think she'd ever been addicted?
I do.
You
I
suspect
do. I suspect
yeah,
that now.
yeah.
She was probably I'm 32 now. She was probably around my age then. And you know, she was like the cool teacher. She's like, she knew all the cool bands. She could relate to us. And yes, I believe that either she herself was or someone very close to her. I had many moments like that where life was warning me, but I refused to see the warnings. An analogy I've used is, you know, a kid touches a hot stove top, they learn not to touch the stove again. I've repeatedly touched the stove top over and over again, expecting to not be burned. And, you know, one thing we say in AA, we say, you know, that insanity is, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting different results. I mean, I did that for 10 years of heavy drug use. As I said, heroin was the game changer for me. At 19, I was going to the University of St. Thomas here in Houston. I was doing well in school. I was immersed in a creative, artistic environment. The people that I knew were all talented kids. They were all sharp, witty, clever. It was exactly the kind of people I wanted to be around. But there was always drugs. I mean, there were always drugs at every social event. There was drugs at every apartment. It was as normal to be offered a line as someone saying, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" You know, it was nothing. And so heroin didn't really seem like that big a deal when I first tried it. It was just another drug on the list. At that point, I'd tried just about everything. But it was like the first time I drank at 12. It was like the rompope all over again. It was like, whatever this feeling is, I'm in love with it, and I want to follow it wherever it'll take me.
Wow.
It was.
You never had like a sobering moment where it's like, okay, hold on. I can't stay high the rest of my life. I got to go to school. I have to be productive. I have to, you know, live my life. I have to get money.
I certainly did have that moment, but the lie, the self-deception was I thought this is going to help me do all those things.
I see.
It removed anxiety. It made me feel confident. It was a long time before I became the kind of heroin addict that's drooling on himself. At first, you probably wouldn't even know that I was on it. I had good grades. I kept a job. At a certain point, I was writing for DUI.com as a copy editor.
Oh, wow.
So it's being functional.
I was a high-functioning addict. You know, I was. I was wearing long sleeves in the summer, so you couldn't see my tracks. But outside of that, it was really remarkable how long I used and kept it secret from even the people closest to me. It did become a problem about halfway through my college career. I moved.
About what age?
21, 22. I was living in Austin, Texas. You know, continuing to go to school there, and that's when there was certainly a shift. I realized it had gone from using heroin once or twice a month to once a week to every single day, always needing more, never having enough money, starting to miss classes, starting to feel sick when I didn't have it. And that's a frightening experience. It's a complete loss of control. When you make the step between recreational use and addict, I think that's when it becomes a physical thing. And it's hard to describe really the discomfort and the agony of physically needing a drug with all of your being.
So is it coming from your stomach, your throat, your brain? I mean, do you feel like you have a headache? Do you feel like you know, like when you're starving, you haven't eaten in a day? I mean, what is it like?
It's like a really terrible flu mixed with this panic, this panic, depression, fear, and you literally are feeling every cell in your body scream out to be
Feed it.
to be fed. Exactly.
Wow.
Yes. And it only gets worse. It only gets worse. You'll feed it that time, and it'll quiet everything down. And really,
About how long would it quiet it down?
I mean, at first maybe about 24 hours, and then that time shrinks and shrinks. The time in between doses shrinks down to where it becomes your full-time job. That's when you lose the job. That's when your grades suffer. That's when your friendships begin to fall off the side, because your entire life is focused on staying well. And at that point, the high is irrelevant. You're not looking for a high. The high, that was back in the early days. What you're looking for is relief. You're looking to no longer be sick. And that desperation is actually what led me to other drugs like methamphetamine. I had never had any interest in speed as a drug. I preferred downers, but I found out from another addict that, you know, swore to me that, look, if you smoke speed, it'll take care of your withdrawal symptoms. Because sometimes there would be heroin droughts. We jokingly referred, amongst my using friends, we referred to the great heroin drought of the second week of November. It was 2 days.
Oh my God!
It was a 2-day-long drought, but let me tell you, it was hell on earth for those 2 days. And so, reaching out for some kind of relief, I tried crack cocaine, I tried methamphetamine, I would drink an entire bottle of gin to myself, anything to make that horrible, sick feeling go away. And the truth is, nothing really would. Only heroin could cure for a moment for those feelings of withdrawal, and the only other choice was to make it through them. You will, if you're struggling with opiate addiction, survive. It might feel like it's going to kill you, but you're actually not in danger of dying from the withdrawals. Other drugs like alcohol, benzodiazepines, you could actually die trying to detox on your own. And I've heard of people who have. That's the kind of detox you want to be in a medical environment.
Which drugs are those?
Xanax, benzodiazepines, Klonopin, alcohol, which both really work on the same part of your brain, and it causes seizures. The withdrawals have these terrible seizures that could kill you. But heroin withdrawal, no matter how horrible you feel, it won't kill you. It's really just these pleasure pathways that you've trained over and over and over again to expect the drug, and so they're like these little hungry mouths. These receptors that you've created are screaming out to be fed, and it's almost like in their confusion they send out the withdrawal signal, and so your body is just miserable. Psychologically, you're miserable, but you're in no immediate danger of actually dying. So that's no comfort to someone going through it. They'll say, no, man, I feel like I'm going to die here. Right. But that was something that when I ultimately did have to face to the last time I got sick, my last time I really kicked, that was something that gave me comfort. I'd remind myself that this will end.
How did you know that? Had you been studying it while you were in your addiction?
Yes, I was always fascinated with addiction, and I wrote my I did like a kind of freshman thesis. I did it on opiate addiction and alternative treatment to opiate addiction. And that was back when I was only chipping, is what addicts refer to as just using occasionally. I was just chipping back then. But I was almost like a doctor inoculating himself with the disease he'd become fascinated with.
Very interesting.
I was fascinated by it. The writers that I admired, many of them were addicts, many of them were alcoholics. Something about the idea that this substance could circumvent my own soul, that was fascinating to me. And that's exactly what it does. By the time it's really fully got hold, it's hard to tell what actions are truly yours anymore and what is just the influence of the drugs and the need for more drugs.
Wow.
Well, can I interject something just as perception from what you're saying? It's such a, it's like I've created this passion and mission in my life, and it's an addiction, and I got a purpose, and the purpose is to defeat this addiction. Just keep knocking me down, but I'm loving the challenge because it's giving me purpose. It's not a good purpose, but in some way it did incite some type of reason to live. At the same time, this could kill me.
That's the way you felt?
Well, I mean...
Are you trying to paraphrase
No,
this?
he's almost telling the same story because I studied cocaine.
Okay.
I started studying
while you
causes.
were addicted?
Well, every time I got in recovery, I became obsessed with the causes and effects of addiction. Like, how is this getting me?
Yes.
And it has to be something in the information that I can find that it can happen to them, but it won't happen to me.
Absolutely.
It's a secret clause. You just have to study it and find out.
And what are you looking for again?
A successful way to use cocaine.
Okay.
Exactly.
So what are you looking for?
So
you're trying to understand it, but you're really not trying to understand it. You're trying to understand where the loophole is. I can keep doing this because I'm so smart.
There you go.
I can keep doing this.
Intellectualizing.
And I can keep. And so you study it to intellectualize it because
I'm smart.
Yeah.
And you want to find out that no matter how low you can go in this, you're not going that low.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. I mean, it's like this series of promises you make to yourself. Well, I'll smoke it, but I'll never shoot it. Well, I'll shoot it, but I'll never shoot it in my neck. Or I'll do this, and you just finally find yourself, You've
done it all.
We've done everything. There's nowhere lower to go. There is no loophole. And I still would say that in a sense, my obsession with addiction it's transformed. It's still my obsession. It's still my life's. I know that whatever I do in life from here on out will be related to incarceration and addiction. That's my fate, I believe. But I want to do it from the point of view of someone who's a recovered addict now, and I want to be able. And I feel that maybe what I went through is so I can empathize with people who are still struggling, because it's hard to empathize with a drug addict, even as a drug addict. I've loved addicts who are still using very much, and even though I know what they're going through and I've been in their shoes, it doesn't make it any less frustrating.
Right.
So for all of the family members who are dealing with, or whatever, your loved one is suffering with addiction, knowing that it's not entirely their fault, knowing that they might very much want to quit, that's not enough to keep from being very frustrated when they wipe out your bank account or steal your car.
Right, right. And you're still paying for that car.
Exactly.
It's still on your credit.
Right.
So, wow. That's some powerful things. You said a lot of powerful things. So what age, I think I got that you were 21, 22 when it became a problem. Mm-hmm. So when was the first time you tried recovery?
The first time I tried recovery was at that age. I came forward to my parents, and
Now, where were they living then?
They were living in Houston, in the Woodlands, a suburb.
And you were in Austin.
Here, and I was in Austin. I came home for the weekend with a very good friend of mine who wasn't a user, who was just there to kind of hold my hand through this, so to speak. And I told my parents, I told them I was an Oxycontin addict because it was an easier pill to swallow. Bad pun. But the truth was I was an intravenous user, and that's the other thing. There's these stigmas attached to this. I was willing to admit that I was an Oxycontin addict, but I wasn't willing to admit that I was intravenously using drugs. Because
now, what's the relationship between Oxycontin and heroin?
They're essentially the same drug. It's
but
just
one is. Tell me the difference.
Well, Oxycontin they've called it hillbilly heroin. It was overprescribed for many years. It was a very, very strong opiate. It came in pill form.
Now, is that a painkiller?
It's a painkiller, yeah, a very powerful painkiller. And when you get down to the chemical, we're talking about essentially the same drug. I mean,
So how is heroin made?
Heroin is a synthetic form of morphine, and it's funny because there's been this trend going all the way back to, if you've ever seen Wild West movies, they were drinking laudanum in those times, which was really just boiling a little bit of morphine and alcohol, and it was a tincture that they would sell for headaches, and women would take them for cramps, and so there was massive problems with addiction due to laudanum. Heroin was first presented as an answer to laudanum addiction. They said, here, take heroin, the new, safer form. And of course, that ended up being much worse. And now we're having the same thing happen with fentanyl. These overdose deaths are attributed to fentanyl, which is an even stronger, easy to make in a kind of bathtub drug type way. You can cook up the fentanyl and sell it as something like China White is this kind of a myth amongst junkies. It's a powdered form of heroin that's just pure and strong. And there is no China White in Texas, but people sell fentanyl under China White, just as you would try to sell a knockoff bag as an Armani or something, But it's poison either way under any name. But these overdose deaths are coming from fentanyl, which is just, especially when combined with other drugs like benzodiazepines. I just lost a very close friend of mine, really beautiful girl named Rachel Moore. She was 25. Most of her adult life she spent struggling with this. We met at the Memorial Hermann Prevention and Recovery Center, which is where I got really wonderful treatment and got clean. And Rachel was doing well while I met her there. She had a relapse that she was never able to fully come out of. And she was aware that combining these drugs led to a respiratory shutdown, and yet she did it. That's the mystifying thing about drug addiction, is that how can you, that's the question I was most asked, is how could you do this knowing how dangerous it was? And I was even more informed than most people because I was reading up on it in my free time. It goes beyond rationality when you've tried something that powerful, that gets under your skin that deeply. There's no rational way out of it. That's why I think recovery, like Alcoholics Anonymous talks about a psychic shift. Cognitive behavioral therapy which I'm a big fan of, talks about like rewiring your habits and thought process, reinforcing good behavior, and trying to identify bad behavior, because it's really, the drugs aren't the problem. They're symptoms to the problem, as Danny said just before the show. The problem is bad thinking, and compound that with media sensationalism around these drugs, and people feeling like there's a stereotype being inflicted on them. People are scared to go seek help, really. I think that I would have gone and sought recovery a lot sooner in my life had it not been for the stigmas attached to them.
So explain that a little bit more.
Sure. Well,
because when you, in my rational mind, that sounds like an excuse, but you know what I mean. In my rational mind, because it's like when you hit rock bottom, whenever it is, ask for help, because you had loving parents,
right,
who wouldn't care if it's shooting heroin, cocaine, whatever it is. They just want you well. They just love you.
Of course,
so.
and I've said.
And I'm old, so I'm old enough to be your mother. So I'm thinking like a mother.
Well, that's you're right, and it's like I mentioned to you before. I can understand that from both sides. I can understand that from the addict who's afraid to tell his parents, and I can understand that from the person who's spoken to addicts and told them exactly what you said. My friend who just passed, I had told her, look, you need to just be honest. I mean, her parents were aware of her struggles, but I was kind of pushing her to be more honest about.
So they'd understand the gravity of it, that she could die any minute. Because
yes.
I didn't understand the opiates, the addiction, but I read about it recently that said the reason why they die so often, and maybe hopefully I'm getting the right drug, is that their respiratory system shut down.
Yeah.
Where other drugs
So you just go to sleep and you don't wake up.
You just don't wake up. You just overdose and just go to sleep. And I never understood, why are they all going to the hospital? Why are they dying like that? So they're just shutting it all down completely. They shut it down too far.
Exactly, and there is a counter to that. There's naloxone. Naloxone, which can come in nasal spray form.
Yeah, and I think maybe the EMS drivers carry
They
it.
do.
It's an antidote.
And let me tell you, it was kind of a fight for that, because that's when it enters a political realm. There's certain people who believe that, well, naloxone is going to just
condone the usage.
That's
like
so
methadone.
crazy.
Exactly.
Can I give a quick analogy?
Certainly.
To when he would describe the stereotypes between telling his parents Oxycontin versus intravenous using, it's like me telling my parents, I got a problem with alcohol, but I'm not a crackhead.
Exactly.
But you really were a crackhead.
Well, I don't even like that term. They're even saying that term.
Let's say colloquially. You were what people like me call a crackhead.
Yeah, that's a perception. So in our neighborhood, it's like he's a crackhead.
A prosecutor might say crackhead, where their parents might say he has a drug problem.
I'm fighting mad you call me a crackhead. I don't care if the crack is on top of my head.
If it's covering your head, if you have a helmet made out of crack.
It's such a demeaning, dehumanizing
So even
label.
the addict is worrying about being dehumanized?
Absolutely.
I didn't, okay.
Right. So,
I got
but
it.
if I tell somebody I have an alcohol problem, you may let me sleep on your couch.
Exactly.
But if I tell you I'm a crackhead, I
might not have a couch.
you're going to leave us.
When I'm scared the next morning, I might not have a couch.
See, my relatives.
Money for that couch.
I played again. I'm still paying for it.
See, when you have a cocaine addiction, your relatives feed you through this door. Like your aunts and they will feed you, but you can't come in inside and sit down at the table.
Right.
They will make you a lunch and hand it to you through the door.
Right.
But if I have an alcohol problem, they probably will let me come in and eat and then get full and leave.
Got it.
Think about that.
Got it. I never thought about that.
Crack cocaine is a really perfect example of the kind of sensationalism I'm talking about. For instance, back in, I believe it was 1986, when the drug laws on crack cocaine were 100 times stronger than laws for powdered cocaine.
Right.
And they're the same drug.
Right.
Okay. The only difference is the method of
and the people.
Exactly.
Mostly the people use.
Yeah, right. It was the people. It was really crack black, powder white.
Exactly.
Oh, that's good. That's a good
and the
analogy.
truth is that most cocaine users were and still are white, but most cocaine arrests were African American, and that continues. I mean, that's
And it's still today.
and becomes that's when it becomes more about this policy and
the politics
and the politics behind this, and even the most streetwise and politically not politically aware junkie is aware that, okay, there are these stigmas attached.
Right.
And even when it comes to family, you know, we will make these little lies and concessions because, okay, it's better to be addicted to a pill than to be a needle junkie. It's better to be an alcoholic than to be a crackhead, because the stigmas are real and they're fearful, and they're the biggest, one of the biggest roadblocks to really overcoming this problem. I mean, the birth rate's down for the second year in a row, and they're attributing that to overdose deaths. I mean, it's been compared to the AIDS crisis for
Now,
our generation.
tell me why the birth rates are down. Just because the people having the babies are dying?
Yeah, in overall, there's been enough overdose deaths that I guess there's not as many people having babies. That's really, honestly, I got this as like a CNN update on my phone.
Yeah, because I would just think that so many young people dying, they are in childbearing age. That would only be the only reason why
It's probably a skewed poll.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to figure out what.
Conflating
why
two
would
things.
that be there? But I mean, because a lot of the people dying are young.
Yes,
in their 20s.
That's
childbearing
true.
age.
And it is, you know, usually rural communities who are being hit the most with overdose deaths. I mean, you're more likely to have an EMS respond quicker and have naloxone. I mean, honestly, people should be able to have naloxone bought over the counter. You should be able to just have it around. I mean,
will using that itself pose any addictive?
On its own, no, absolutely not.
No, so it's just a.
All it does is
antidote.
knock the. So, you know, let's say this is your opioid receptors, and it's got heroin or whatever there. The naloxone knocks that off the receptor, which has like a Lazarus-like effect where you'll just come back, but you're going to be in what's called precipitated withdrawal. So you're going to come back, you're going to be alive, but you're not going to be very happy to be alive. I mean, physically, you're just going to be miserable. I know this because, you know, you asked me a moment ago when I first went into recovery. At 23, I went on Suboxone treatment, and Suboxone is buprenorphine, which is a different opiate analog that, you know, fills those receptors and keeps you from having the withdrawal symptoms. But it also has naloxone, which creates like a kind of shield. So if I take the Suboxone and I already have opiates in my system, it'll put me in precipitated withdrawal. And that was meant to be, basically it was meant to be like a punishment to say, you know, if you use this correctly, you won't have withdrawals and you'll be all right. But if you try to cheat or play with the Suboxone, you're gonna have this. And precipitated withdrawals were amongst the most hellish feelings I've had in my life. I mean, just miserable. So Suboxone worked for me for 4 years. I considered myself cured of heroin addiction.
So what age group is that where you cured?
From 23 to about 27, 28.
Wow, that's pretty good.
It wasn't bad, but I mean, I was using other drugs during that time.
Like what?
Well, anything. Cocaine, alcohol.
You just weren't using heroin.
I just wasn't using heroin.
Cured of heroin.
Cured of heroin. But I really did consider myself cured of addiction. I couldn't see that I was still, you know, abusing alcohol, and that I was still, you know, I think I went through 2 pretty bad car accidents at the time that were just because of alcohol. I mean, I was something I would say in meetings.
Did you get DWIs?
I didn't actually get DWIs.
Wow.
I was and I was drinking and driving a lot. I got lucky break after lucky break, but the lucky breaks will run out one day. Either you're incarcerated or you're dead. I mean, there's a certain level where it won't. And I want to point out that that's not true for everybody. I mean, the great percentage of drug users are recreational and will remain recreational. I think one of the things we need to battle is this one hit, I'm hooked mentality, because that's sensationalism. That's you know, putting everyone in a state of fear, and we need to be unemotional. You know, I really believe in scientific, fact-based treatment modules, and there's all these different treatment modules now. You know, we have faith-based ones, we have 12 steps, and we have all these different groups.
What? I got a phone call. So if there's someone on the phone, please state your question.
Yeah, for Chris, I just wanted to know if there's any certain songs that trigger any of his addictions.
Any songs?
Yeah, like, or any kind of, you know, triggers that he might have, but specifically in music.
Yes. You know, it's funny. It's funny.
Do you know him or something?
I was going to say that's a pretty specific question.
That is.
But you know, it's actually a valid question. When I was at Memorial Hermann Prevention and Recovery Center, one of the classes that we had was a music. It was like a music therapy, and they played songs that were usually associated with drug use. They played Pink Floyd, and God, I can't remember what else they played. I think they played an Eminem song. But basically, they turned the lights off, and the idea was to reassociate clean memories with songs that were previously associated with drug use. And it did work in the sense that if I hear Pink Floyd now, I think back on on that moment at the park and not all the many times that I used drugs and heard Pink Floyd. But there was a period of readjustment. Some of my favorite music to listen to, even books, were so heavily associated with heroin that it took a long time to redefine them. For me, it was the Velvet Underground song "Heroin." As cliche as that is, I used to like to play that song
and get high.
So that's. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
And I want to ask something. When you say triggers on a gun, a trigger does what? It makes the gun go off.
Mm-hmm.
So in addiction, what a trigger does is it creates drug thoughts. Drug thoughts create drug cravings. And what we have to deal with is we can't eliminate drug thoughts. But what we can do is look at how do we deal with the craving. Mm-hmm. Because we can't know where trigger's going to come from. Like the caller just said, I can be driving and a song can come on and it can trigger.
Right, and you can't go turn off and go to the dope house.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
So the trigger is the music, and it brings on drug thoughts. Mm-hmm. So the drug thoughts, the body has a drug craving. Like you're thinking about Bluebell ice cream, you saw the commercial, now I want some Bluebell.
Right.
I'm in the store, I'm gonna go buy the Bluebell.
So our time is getting short. Good analogy. And we haven't talked about your trouble with the criminal justice system. So tell me about that.
As I said, I'd been very lucky for a long time. Driving drunk, petty crime, burglaries. There was a number of illegal things that I did just to get by as an addict. What I started to experience were these kind of psychotic breaks. And this was more from the methamphetamine use. I told you that I'd been introduced to methamphetamines as a kind of cure for these withdrawal symptoms when heroin wasn't around. Of course, that led to using methamphetamine and heroin together. And that just shredded my mind and soul. I would have these kind of pockets of disappearing, almost like someone else was behind the controls. I ended up jumping out of a 2-story window and did a month in Harris County Psychiatric Center because I was so positive that I was being attacked, that these people were breaking into my house. And
so that you had bad hallucinations.
And I, as a drug user, I was familiar with hallucinations, but I could not tell that these weren't real. And in that fight or flight moment of fear, I ended up hurting the very people I loved the most. I couldn't recognize reality, couldn't recognize them as who they were. The kind of typical drug paranoia that's dangerous. A human being is very dangerous when they're that threatened and that afraid. And I've seen it in other drug addicts. There's probably there's a huge amount of what used to be called crimes of passion. Crimes that happen in the moment are they can just happen, and before you know it, someone's dead. And I thank God, I think whatever, spirits or forces are out there that I didn't, because the people in question were my father and my girlfriend, the people that I love more than anyone in the world. And they called the police because they literally, they didn't know what else to do with me, and they were hoping that would be the moment that I got help. I don't think that they thought it would end up with me, going to jail for 4 months, but I'm glad. And
now, was that in jail in Montgomery County?
Montgomery County.
Okay.
I've jokingly referred to jail as the best treatment center I've ever been to, but it's almost not a joke. What I needed was a place where I was cut off from drugs for an extended period of time. That's it.
Did you detox and go through the pain, or did they give you some medicine?
There was no medicine. It's hard to even really think back on that experience because I think the human mind suppresses pain.
Oh, no.
So that's what leads us back a lot of the times. We forget how bad it was, and then we think, well,
Wasn't that bad? I lived through it.
I lived through it.
I don't remember it.
Exactly. But I know that I remember enough to know that I never want to go through anything
Now,
like
why
that.
were you only in jail for 4 months? Like, this dude did 15 years. So I'm trying to figure out why was yours 4 months.
Well, okay, the 4 months were, I could have spent longer in there. My family didn't want to bail me out, so I did the 4 months. And after and I could have stayed. My court case wasn't until another 6 or 7 months afterwards. So I could have stayed the full time. But, you know, after 4 months of being in jail, I started attending my first meetings in jail. The man who brought meetings into Montgomery County Jail ended up becoming becoming my sponsor on the outside. He's still someone I look up to and that I'm in touch with. After 4 months, we decided, okay, let's move to treatment. And, you know, this is where my family comes in. This is what I had that a lot of people don't. I saw a lot of people that had the same crimes or even lesser crimes than me go away because they just didn't have that support there. Literally, if you're someone that can't bond yourself out of jail, that sends a message in the court. Well, what kind of support system does this person have? If we let them out, what's to keep them? And that's, you know, that's might seem cold, but there's something to it. I mean,
There is something to it, but it is cold.
It is cold.
But it is something to it because you need a support system.
And for a lot of people that I see go, you know, out of incarceration to drug court or something. I mean, your willpower. I mean, if it were willpower alone, we would have all gotten sober a long time ago. But if you go from jail back to the same environment, around the same people, the same pressures, the same triggers, you'd have to be superhuman almost to make it through that.
How did you do it?
I lived in a sober living house. I moved completely to a different part of town, and
what type part of town?
I was living in Chinatown. It was right on Gessner and Bel Air. It was 9 men, 8 or 9 of us. I mean, we looked like the most motley group of people. We went out shopping.
There's a sober house across the street from a property I have on Alabama. It's 14 men that live there. It's not paid for by the state. They pay to live there, and there's a guy in charge. He works during the daytime. He's an ex-addict. But he's the Mr. Robert Garcia. He's in charge of the house. That's what that is across the street from the back of my old office.
Oh, you pointed that out to me. You said
it's
they look
14
out.
Men.
You said
they look out for me.
That works for you.
It works
work
for me.
against you.
Yeah, because it looks bad because they all look like, you know, they look all different. Some of them look like him. One was on probation out of North Dakota or something, on parole, so he couldn't leave. Used to be a bus stop right there in my old office. So he'd catch the bus. They were just waiting to go home, but it was called a sober house.
That's where it was really, it was
still there. And they're in and out, and if they use, they get kicked out.
You get kicked out. And that's not to say you can't be let back in.
Right.
We had guys who relapsed, got kicked out, came back in, and the person I'm thinking of in particular right now is a sobriety coach today. You know, he had trouble, he got kicked out, but he really did prove himself. And
how long did you stay in the sober house?
I stayed in the sober house about 6 months, and then...
And your parents paid for it?
Yes. And again, that's you know, without that support, I mean, I had nothing at that time.
Right.
I had been, you know, working at a, you know, a law firm. I'd been working at DUI.com writing copy. We were talking before the show about how we have these things that we tell ourselves, well, this is what I've got. You know, I'm an addict, but hey, I've got a good job. Those things allowed me to keep using longer. When you have nothing left and you have to really, the humility to ask whoever it is, your family, friends, anyone, like, please, I need help. Even if you don't have money, there are sober houses out there that will work with you. There's DARS funding. I met the owner, Jim Phelps, at an AA meeting. He's no longer with us, unfortunately.
The owner, he passed away?
He passed away, and he had something like 18 years of sobriety, and he'd begun drinking again. We didn't know that, and he was dead 9 months later.
What killed him?
His liver just shut him down. I mean, this was a guy who I think saved my life. You know, he gave me a bed and a place to go when no one else would. And man, he was tough on me. He made me get up and go hit a meeting at 5 in the morning. You know, I'd go out, and he said, you better not be home till after 4. I don't care what you're doing. It better be something constructive, but you can't just hang around the house.
Sound like my mama.
Right? He whipped me into shape, though. And eventually, when the time came to go before a judge, Jim Phelps came and spoke on my behalf. And, you know, he was a tough, salt-of-the-earth guy, and it took a lot to convince him that I was worth fighting for. But when I saw that someone else had that kind of belief in me, it made me able to believe in myself. You know, something that you hear in recovery is, you know, we'll love you till you can love yourself. And it took a long time for me to be able to love myself. It's something I'm still working on, but, you know, they were willing to do that for me until I was able to.
So once you left the sober house after 6 months, where'd you go?
After that, I moved back up north to Montgomery County, where I, you know, began drug court. I started going back to school. I live with my father in Montgomery County, and I'm still there with my father right now.
So
required
he gave you another chance
after that.
Wow.
Yeah, after.
He's not afraid you're going to sell everything he has in the house or pack the car? Or...
It took a while to get to that point, and I would be lying if I said he doesn't have reservations. He'd be crazy not to. But you know, it's been 3 years. 3 good years. You know, I got back to school and you know, worked.
Are you working? Are you able to work?
Yeah, I'm working. I have 2 part-time jobs. One of them is how I met Danny. I'm working as a fiction editor with our school's magazine, and we were noticing that we were getting inmate artwork and poems from all across the country. And you know, with my background, I thought, well, this is an opportunity. So that's what I was doing on the prison show. I was, you know, calling for submissions on the show, saying, you know, hey guys, send us your experience, your poems, your writing. We'd like to make an issue focused on incarcerated artists. And UHD is a big criminal justice school, so it'd be good for kids that are going to go on to be in law enforcement to some capacity or another to see the human aspect of it.
And what are you studying now?
I'm a literature student studying creative writing.
Now, where are you in school now?
I graduate this semester.
From where?
From University of Houston downtown.
Okay, so you didn't go back to, I didn't know if you went back to University of St. Thomas.
Oh no, I jumped around. I went from University of St. Thomas to University of St. Edwards in Austin, but UHD is my real home. That's the best
You feel
school I've
good?
ever gone to.
Okay, all right. Well, one of your mentors is there, right?
Yeah, Dr. Jonathan Chisholm.
Dr. Jonathan Chisholm, who started the Path to Freedom at our church.
Oh, that's right.
For
I've
the
heard of Dr.
ex-cons,
Chisholm.
yeah.
Right, yes.
Yeah,
I-
Yeah,
there.
when we talked
we
about,
talked about him.
one of your friends there knows him as a student.
Yeah. Well,
I'm so proud of
that's
you.
wonderful. So tell me, what's the state of your probation in Montgomery County?
Well, I've got a few more months left on it's DUI court, and I ended up in DUI court even though I didn't have a DUI because the judge wanted to, you know, keep an eye on me, and it was an opportunity to be in DUI court. DUI court, drug court. This is one of the more progressive.
Now, why you didn't do drug court versus DUI court? I don't.
Because the judge who was in charge of my case was in charge of drug court, but she's now in charge of DUI court.
I see. So you're following the judge.
I'm following the judge.
That's Kathleen Hamilton?
Yes, and she's a fair and forward-thinking judge who is compassionate, and she really commands the respect of everyone in that court.
And now, is this a misdemeanor or a felony court?
This is a felony court. It's felony drug and alcohol offenses, and there are a few other people who, you know, maybe didn't get exactly a DUI but have ended up there because of Judge under her discretion.
So you'll be off probation this year?
No, I still have years left on my probation.
Oh, okay, years left on
I
your
have
probation.
years left on
Hear
my
how you said it, years left on this probation.
Yes.
But you'll be finished with the program.
I'll be finished with the drug court program, hopefully in the next 6 months.
A quick unique story you told me. You wrote an article while you were incarcerated, and it got in the hands of a publisher. Give us a quick.
Yeah, I wrote. Well, actually, you know, it was in jail that I started really writing again. When the guys in there found out that, you know, I had an interest in writing, everybody wanted to share their story. Everyone wanted, and so I would just take notes. I would just interview the guy. We had nothing but time on our hands. One of those stories ended up being picked up by In Recovery magazine. It was a story about my first meeting, which literally was, you know, coming off of heroin in this tank. This guy offers me a cup of coffee and asked me if I wanted to join him for a meeting. I thought he was insane, but it ended up being the only little piece that I had felt in a very long time. And it was really those first few meetings in jail that held the most power for me. So that was just a simple 2-page story. A longer story was more a character study I did on a man I'd met inside whose prison name was Silent, and you know, tough prison name, tough guy. The man's
So silent, like he never talks, or he
more
talks
like
too
you
much?
never hear him coming.
Oh, you hear him coming? Oh, wow.
Yeah. And you know, he scared me to death at first, and I really was terrified that he was going to do some harm to me. But he ended up becoming a real friend of mine, someone that I visited even after he came out of prison, someone that I wrote to. You know, he went to TDC. I ended up following a different path. We stayed in touch, and I saw that underneath the tattoos, underneath the, you know, he'd done 15 years flat, and underneath all of that was this like really gentle person. He discovered religion in there, which was, you know, a different path than me. I'm not a very religious person, but I saw that it was genuine. And every night during, you know, the prayer circle in the tank, he would basically preach, and with tears in his eyes. I mean, this was a man who, you know, had once told me that if he could burn all the gang tattoos off of his body, he would endure any pain just to be clean again. And
Wow.
he would, you know, even though he had no money, no one on the outside helping him out, he would take things from his own commissary and put it in other people's bunks because he believed in kind of paying it forward, and he believed in doing good deeds for the sake of good deeds. I mean, at the same time, he was someone who'd done some very questionable things with
Very
his
bad
life.
things, yes.
So
Very violent things.
From the
it sounds like.
perspective of a writer, that's about the best character
Oh, no.
you could find.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful.
He was full of conflict, and yet there was something about him that I found deeply sympathetic. So
Right,
that story isn't out yet, but
keep working on that.
It'll be
good.
out on the Big Round Table is the name of the site. They publish true stories.
Well, one of the things you might consider, I know when I was running for judge one time and lost, I was going to write short stories because there's so many stories. I find criminal law and the people in it so fascinating because it could be any of us, but for the grace of God if you're religious, or but for just, you know, the fate of the stars. I mean, because it could be anybody.
Absolutely.
Like you went all those years without getting in trouble, but yet you did eventually get in trouble, and wow, it was through your own family members.
Exactly.
So, and then you get in trouble 3 times and have to go 3 different times, and you're hiding it
Who's
from your
counting?
family members. But we don't have to count anymore, do we? When it's 3 was a charm for you.
So can I get my?
Absolutely, it's 3 minutes.
So to sum this up, without education about addiction, most addicts will either end up in jail, in institution, die, or relapse. However, by learning how relapse occurs, understanding how to prevent relapse, and learning the warning signs that lead to relapse, for us, relapse can be prevented. And I appreciate Chris taking that aspect of looking at addiction in the educational side. I'm going to educate myself on what is causing harm in my life to figure out how to prevent it from taking my life. So that's a message to anyone that's out there, that if you're not struggling with addiction, but if you have family members just struggling with addiction, if they don't have the willingness to educate themselves, you do it for them and stand in the gap for them. Many of us recover. The ones that don't have the capacity to be honest with themselves, that usually don't be able to follow this simple program.
1 minute. So let you have the last word.
You know, all I can really say is that recovery, like addiction, is a full-time job. If you're out there and you're struggling with addiction, you've probably done amazing things just to get your high for the day, which shows that you're determined, which shows that you're clever and quick on your feet. If you could put that same amount of effort into your recovery, then I promise you there's a better life on the other side. If you work half as hard as you've been working for your high for recovery, you not only will be able to help yourself, but other people, and lead by example.
And what do you do for your triggers? I mean, what do you do to fight them? Because you're 32, you're still a young man. And so, you know, there are going to be a lot of triggers, a lot of disappointments, major disappointments. The disappointments sometimes get bigger in life.
Absolutely.
They don't get smaller. So what is your plan?
My plan when it comes to the triggers is to redefine my way of looking at them. Like the caller mentioned music. It's been a slow journey redefining them, but now I no longer I don't hear a song and think, oh, I want to get high. I hear that song and I think of how far I've come. I think of how lucky I am to hear that song. Many of my friends would have much rather, I mean, they're dead, so they can't really say it either way. But it would be lovely if they could be alive hearing those songs. Triggers are uncomfortable, but so is being alive. And
thank you. I'm so glad you're alive. I'm getting the wrap-up signal, so I'm so glad you're here, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
We support you. We're praying for you. We're rooting for you. You can do this. It's a good life. I'm 59. I'm glad to be here. I didn't want to always be here when I was younger for all of my demons, but I made it, and it's better on the other side. So keep pushing forward. Don't give up.
Thank
you. Thank you, Danny, for bringing Chris here and hearing his story.
Again.
And happy birthday, Danny. Good night, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you for watching.